Beloved by the god of science and objectivity, academia has maintained a privileged position in the realm of knowledge. Colonialism has managed to export its forms of knowledge production into global hegemony through the trajectory of official nationalisms within empires that introduce state-endorsed education for its colonized subjects. This is particularly visible as English has become the dominant language in which scholarly work is published worldwide, even in institutions that typically teach in their native languages. Language, however, is also an indicator to other socio-cultural legacies left behind by colonialism, such as the methodology and values of academic knowledge production, in which scientific, empirical thinking and technical writing have become a tight uniform within academia. It's quite visible through not just the homogenization of language, but also the homogenization of imagination. As the ambivalently regarded Foucault regards it, power and discourse have a dialectical relationship with each other, both producing their own knowledge and thus shaping each other in some way. For example, in the context of a state's coercive and violent power, the experience of that power shapes specific discourses for, against, and all encompassed by that power, which subsequently shapes the functions of that power in and of itself. So in the context of a post-colonial world, how have the colonial powers formed the discourses of the world? Well, at the base of it, colonialism has a strong discursive links to the Enlightenment era, one drunk with the liquor of positivism and empiricism, which had produced a self-assured objectivism amongst the majority of the intellectual elite of the era. Europe at the time, and still now, was a heavily patriarchal society, in which women were often excluded alongside the peasant and working classes from formal education in the state. As patriarchal epistemology and positivist philosophy combined in these exclusive intellectual circles, particularly paternalistic forms of knowledge were produced, and in combination with the rise of a profiteering bourgeoisie, the civilizing mission came into the zeitgeist. An ideological machine that produces not a system of exploitation and justification beyond belief that traumatizes not only its colonized subjects, but also those of who carried it out. The reason I say this is because the only legitimate realms of knowledge were those of logic and reason, a priori knowledge, where reality had to be proven, and those who could approve were blind to their own constellation of assumptions, ones starved from validation of subjective experience and imagination. Dedicated to a civilized way of living, in which propriety and obedience to your superiors is of utmost value, the muscle of empathy and compassion is slowly atrophied. So genealogy is a rejection of objective superiority. So how does it provide an alternative? Genealogy represents the ideal of an ecologically minded, feminist mode of producing knowledge, to kill the dominant man, in which knowledge is used as a tool for liberation rather than subjugation. The goal is to liberate oneself from the clutches of a domineering objective mentality, represented by the dominant man, which denies the plurality and multitude of subjective experiences and homogenizes the individual through subjugation. Reading Liberating Life by Abdullah Öcalan, it is clear that there are flaws in his discourse. The alternative historicism, the inability to shed nationalist myths, the essentialist interpretations of feminine qualities. However, genealogy provides a vital pathway, particularly for a population of women who have dealt with patriarchal violence, primarily through the concept of namus, using chastity and honor as a means to control women's bodies and lives. His reading reads women as more connected to nature than men, emerging from what is probably lifelong inspiration of nationalist discourses and women's as creators of life. Yet I would argue paradoxically he both reproduces some essentialist characterization of women and men and simultaneously proposes ideological and practical approaches that have more fundamentally disruptive effect on patriarchy than other fields of feminist thought. His intent may not be to dispel the gender binary, but can help level the hierarchy, particularly given his vast area of significant influence. This ties with his emphasis on a pluralist society, where he sees the fundamental differences make no effect given the deep rights to freedoms that he envisages for everyone. And why he also necessitates the existence of separate women's organisations to rebalance the broken equilibrium of gendered appreciation of work, where caring and reproductive work have been systematically undervalued. Part of developing this science of women and life is to create a system of knowledge production that ultimately situates the person engaging in it. There is inherent value in the subjective experience of those engaged, and thus academia and science, though through one style of creating knowledge, is no longer valued above and beyond. Within the stories and experiences crafted through literature, art, and oratory, histories and memories are stored. There is knowledge, advice, and wisdom that cannot be explained in plain academies, but rather in narrative and imagination. Such has been the mistake of the European intellectual tradition. The rejection of imagination and romance is the rejection of one reality for another, and both inevitably create myths. They're engaging in a project aiming to dismantle the hegemony of the nation state and supplant it with one based on some level of appreciation for the subjective experience, an active production of a situated science and democratic confederalism, a structured format for participatory democracy aimed at leveling the playing field, where the capacity of political decision making is grown from an acknowledged situation rather than an objective standpoint. This does not mean that they're free from the obstacles presented by a world drenched in nationalism and capitalism, but they're working to undermine the hierarchical forms that constitute such a framework. It's important to note that the project is relatively nascent, and as such, criticism is a virtue, and yet so is cautious optimism. The projects of genealogy and democratic confederalism have an important international role to play as a conscious anti-nation state and decolonial experiment. It has a social life and can become infectious if its liberatory goals are actualized.